Elaine Carter had built her mornings around quiet routines ever since her husband, David, passed away 2 years earlier. It was her way of keeping herself steady in a world that often felt too loud and too empty at the same time. Every day, she woke up early, opened the curtains to let the soft daylight warm her living room, and prepared a simple breakfast of toast and coffee. She tried to convince herself that these peaceful mornings meant she was doing fine, that grief was no longer hovering over her like a dark cloud. But deep inside, she knew that the silence in her house had grown heavier ever since David, a decorated army medic, died unexpectedly. The only living thing that kept her company, the one who seemed to understand her grief without a single word, was Max, David's loyal German shepherd. Now hers. Max had once been trained as a service dog, deeply bonded to David, and in a way, he still served with silent discipline, always alert, always protective. He never let Elaine walk out the door alone. Each morning, when she picked up his leash, Max wagged his tail with excitement, yet maintained a calm, purposeful posture. He was not just a pet. He was the last living piece of her husband, and she cherished him as fiercely as someone would guard their own heart. The sun was warm that morning, brighter than usual for early spring. Elaine stepped outside wearing a light gray sweater, jeans, and her comfortable walking shoes. Birds chirped softly from the maple trees lining her street. The gentle breeze carried the smell of fresh grass, reminding her of the weekends she once spent with David at the park, sharing picnics under the sun. She inhaled deeply as she began her walk, trying to let the fresh air fill the empty parts of her chest. Max walked proudly beside her, his ears flicking with every sound. Elaine always admired how alert he was. Sometimes she wondered how much of David's spirit had stayed alive inside this dog. She whispered to Max as they turned the corner, "You ready for your favorite spot?" Max looked up, eyes bright, tongue out, as if saying, "Always." But as they approached the little community park, something changed. Max slowed down first, then stiffened. His ears shot up, and a low growl rolled out of his throat. Elaine frowned and gently patted his side, thinking maybe he had spotted a stray cat or a squirrel. But Max didn't move his gaze. His entire body stood rigid like a soldier sensing danger. Elaine followed his stare, her heart skipping a beat, when she noticed 3 unfamiliar men standing near the walking path. They looked out of place in the peaceful morning scenery. They were dressed in rough, dark clothes, hoodies, worn jeans, heavy boots, nothing unusual, yet something about their energy felt wrong. They weren't talking, laughing, or minding their own business. They were staring at her, directly, as if waiting for her to come closer. A chill crawled up her spine. For a moment, Elaine considered turning around, but she didn't want to appear scared. Her therapist always reminded her that she needed to reclaim her independence, that fear had already taken too much of her life after David's death. So she straightened her back and kept walking, hoping she was misreading the situation. But Max knew better. He tugged the leash, trying to pull her away. Yet Elaine whispered, "It's okay, boy," still convincing herself the men were just hanging around. She tried to focus on the sunlight filtering through the leaves, the soft crunch of gravel under her shoes, anything but the growing discomfort inside her chest. But as she took a few more steps, the men shifted. One stepped forward, then another. They weren't leaving, they were approaching. She froze. The tallest man, with a shaved head and a scar along his cheek, smirked as if he enjoyed the fear spreading across her face. The second man cracked his knuckles while the third scanned the empty path around them. The park was unusually quiet. No joggers, no families, no elderly couples feeding birds. Just Elaine, Max, and these 3 strangers whose intentions were beginning to feel frighteningly clear. Elaine swallowed hard. "Come on, Max," she whispered, trying to slowly back away. But it was too late. The men stepped closer, blocking her path, cutting off her escape. Max bared his teeth, his growl deepening, loud enough to echo through the air. Elaine tightened her grip on his leash, her hands trembling, unsure whether restraining him was helping or putting them both at risk. Her heart pounded so hard it almost drowned out everything else. A heavy wave of dread washed over her when the man with the scar said in a cold, Casual voice. Morning, lady. Nice dog you got there. Elaine didn't respond. She didn't trust her voice not to shake. She clutched Max's collar with one hand and held her purse strap with the other, trying to stay calm, though every instinct screamed at her to run. The men exchanged glances, the kind criminals give each other when they agree on a plan without saying it out loud. Max lunged forward slightly, forcing Elaine to pull him back, her muscles shaking with effort. The man chuckled darkly. Relax, we just want to talk. But Elaine knew there was nothing friendly about their intentions. Her throat tightened, and her legs felt weak. She thought of David, how he always used to shield her from danger, how safe she felt with him by her side. But he wasn't here. She was alone. Alone except for Max, who was ready to defend her with everything he had. Fear crept through her body like cold water. But she kept whispering to Max, trying to soothe him, "It's all right, boy, it's okay." Though she didn't believe her own words, she was completely unaware that someone else was watching too. Across the street, seated at a cafe table with a clear view of the path, a man wearing a gray hoodie and mirrored sunglasses had been observing the entire scene with a quiet intensity. He saw Elaine's fear. He saw Max's protective stance. He saw the men closing in on her. His jaw tightened. This man was no ordinary bystander. He was a retired Navy SEAL. And unlike the thugs, he knew exactly what he was looking at, a threat about to explode. And this was the moment. His instincts whispered one thing. It's time to stay alert. Something is very wrong here. Elaine felt her breath tightening as the three men closed in, forming a half circle around her like predators who had finally cornered their prey. The peaceful feeling she had enjoyed just minutes earlier evaporated into a chilling sense of danger. Max pressed closer to her leg, muscles coiled, teeth exposed, as if he already understood that this situation could quickly turn violent. She could feel the tremor in her hands as she held onto his leash, trying to keep him from jumping at the men. But she also knew he might be the only thing standing between her and whatever these strangers planned to do. The tallest man, the one with the scar on his cheek, stared at her with a look that made her skin crawl. It wasn't anger or casual disrespect, it was something colder, something that told her he had done this before and had no hesitation about doing it again. He leaned forward just slightly and said, "Give us the bag. Nobody gets hurt." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a dangerous authority, the kind that left no room for negotiation. Elaine's fingers tightened around her purse instinctively. Inside it was nothing valuable, just her keys, wallet, tissues, and an old photo of David she always carried. It wasn't the cost of the items she feared losing. It was the idea of handing anything over to these men, admitting defeat, allowing herself to be stripped of her safety, that filled her chest with dread. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Her voice felt trapped behind the waves of panic rising inside her. She tried to step back, but all three men stepped forward at the same time, forcing her to freeze. Max growled louder, pulling forward with such force that Elaine nearly lost her balance. The scarred man smirked and glanced at the dog. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. "Control your mutt." His words hit her ears like an insult, but she was too afraid to argue. Still, she instinctively pulled Max even closer. The man beside him, a younger guy with a baseball cap worn backward, nudged the third man and whispered something Elaine couldn't hear. They all chuckled, a sound that made her stomach twist. Something wasn't right. They weren't just after her purse. Their eyes kept drifting back to Max. She felt it. She noticed it. And then the man with the cap confirmed her fear when he said with a shrug, "The dog might be worth something too." Elaine felt a jolt of terror crash through her like a shockwave. Max wasn't just a pet, he was family, a living memory of her husband, a companion who never left her side. The thought of losing him made her heart shatter. "Please," she finally managed to whisper, her voice trembling so badly the word barely formed. "Leave him alone." But the cap-wearing man stepped closer and reached out, grabbing Max's leash with a rough jerk. Max barked sharply, snapping toward him, causing the man to yank harder. Elaine let out a strangled cry, terrified that Max might get hurt, or worse, provoke the dangerous men, The scarred man shook his head, irritated, and glared at her. "Look, lady, it's simple," he said, tone sharpening. "Give us the bag. Give us anything you got. Or we take the dog instead." The threat hung in the air, thick and terrifying. Elaine felt her knees weakening. Her legs trembled so badly she thought they might give out. The idea of handing over Max, losing him the way she lost David, was unbearable. She looked down at her dog as tears prickled her eyes. Max was still growling, ready to defend her, unaware that he was the one in danger. Before she could form a response, before she could think of any way to protect herself and Max at the same time, the third man suddenly pulled a switchblade from his pocket. The metallic click echoed through the quiet park like a warning bell. The blade glinted sharply in the sunlight, and Elaine's vision blurred with fear. She instinctively stepped backward, but the men pushed forward again, refusing to give her space. It felt as if the whole world had shrunk to this small patch of pathway, and she had nowhere to run, nowhere to cry for help, nowhere to hide. Her breath became rapid and shallow as she realized this was no simple robbery. This was a threat to her life and to Max's life. Across the street, the retired Navy SEAL Jack Dalton had been watching all of this unfold with increasing tension. He had seen criminals before. He had studied them. He had fought them in war zones where danger lurked behind every wall, every corner, every shadow. But something about this scene pulled at him in a deeper way. He saw not just criminals, but predators circling a woman who had no idea how to defend herself. He saw a brave dog trying to protect its owner, but outnumbered by humans who wouldn't hesitate to injure it. And he saw an unmistakable moment where intervention became no longer optional, but necessary. As the man with the switchblade moved closer to Elaine, Jack straightened in his chair. His military-trained eyes assessed the stance of each man, the scarred one leading the intimidation, the cap-wearing one grabbing the dog's leash, and the third one with the knife ready for escalation. Jack could tell exactly who would strike first, who would panic, and who would try to run if things went wrong. He subconsciously calculated distances, angles, timing, all the small details that could determine whether he could neutralize the threat without causing unnecessary harm. A lifetime of training had conditioned him to evaluate danger with cold precision. But another part of him, one that remembered what it was like to watch innocent people get hurt, stirred with quiet anger when the cap-wearing man yanked Max again, making the dog whimper in pain for a moment. Something inside Jack snapped into firm resolve. He stood slowly, his expression calm yet determined, and placed his coffee cup down with deliberate care. There was no rush in his movements, no panic, no hesitation. He moved not like a civilian, but like a soldier returning to the battlefield, guided by instinct stronger than fear. He stepped away from the cafe table and began walking toward the park path, his steps quiet, his gaze locked on the threat ahead. His jaw tightened, his eyes sharpened, his hands relaxed not into fists, but into the controlled readiness of someone who knew exactly what he had to do. Elaine had no idea that help was already coming. All she knew was that the three men surrounding her were growing more aggressive by the second. She felt utterly alone in that moment, trembling with fear as she murmured, "Please, please don't hurt him. Please don't." But her words fell on deaf ears. The man with the knife stepped closer, and Elaine's heart pounded violently as she held Max tighter, desperate for a miracle. And that miracle, wearing a gray hoodie and calm eyes trained by war, was already just a few steps away, moving with the silent promise that the nightmare was about to meet a force it never expected. Jack Dalton moved through the quiet morning street with a calmness that did not match the danger unfolding in front of him. To anyone watching, he looked like an ordinary man taking a slow walk, perhaps stretching his legs after finishing his coffee. But inside him, a different machine had awakened, one that had been forged through years of war, discipline, and survival. His posture, though relaxed, carried the controlled awareness of a trained warrior. His breathing remained slow and steady, but his heartbeat shifted into the familiar rhythm he always felt right before a mission. Jack had seen violence in its worst forms: ambushes in dusty alleys, gunfire echoing through foreign villages, terrified civilians hiding behind broken walls, and, as he watched the three men surrounding Elaine Carter, his instinct screamed that this situation was crossing into dangerous territory. He knew exactly how quickly a simple threat could turn into bloodshed. The wind was gentle, brushing the leaves of the trees and carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass. Children's laughter usually filled this park during afternoons, but right now it was painfully quiet, the kind of silence that made danger feel louder. Jack's boots pressed against the sidewalk with slow, deliberate steps. He didn't rush, because rushing caused panic, and panic caused mistakes. Mistakes were unacceptable when an innocent woman and a loyal dog were trapped. His mind worked fast, but his body moved with the patience of a predator, calculating the perfect moment to strike. From the angle he approached, he could now fully see the expressions on the men's faces, the twisted amusement, the arrogance, the cruel satisfaction of believing they had control. But what they didn't see was the danger walking toward them in plain sight. Jack's eyes briefly flicked toward Elaine. Her fear was written all over her face. Her lips trembled, her hands shook, and her shoulders curled inward like she was shrinking under the weight of their threats. He could see the exact moment her fight or flight instincts had collapsed into helpless terror. That look made something tighten inside his chest, a protective anger. He had not felt this strongly in a long time. She reminded him of the villagers he once protected overseas, people who were always outmatched by predators who preyed on the weak. Jack had promised himself after retirement that he was done with combat, done with violence, done with stepping into danger. But he also knew that certain oaths could never truly be retired. A seal never turned away from someone who needed protection. Not then, not now, not ever. Max, the German shepherd, tugged again, growling deeply as he tried to keep himself between Elaine and the men. Jack admired the dog's bravery, Max's stance, the way he positioned his body, the intensity in his eyes. All of it reminded Jack of military working dogs he had been deployed with. Dogs who had saved lives, detected ambushes, and guarded their handlers with unwavering loyalty. Max wasn't trained for combat like those dogs, but he had something stronger, a protective spirit sharpened by love. Yet Jack could see the danger too. The man with the backward cap was pulling Max's leash harder now, bullying the dog without caring how much it hurt. If Max snapped in defense, the man with the switchblade would react instantly. Animals did not understand human cruelty, and Max could get seriously injured for trying to protect his owner. Jack's jaw clenched. He had seconds, maybe less. He positioned himself behind a parked SUV, using it as temporary cover while he assessed the scene one last time. This wasn't a battlefield, but the same rules applied. Identify the strongest threat first, anticipate the second, and disable the third before he could escape or escalate. The man with the knife was clearly the main threat. He held the power to inflict immediate harm. The scarred leader was physically dominant and carried the attitude of someone who thought pain was amusing. The man with the cap, despite his cowardly posture, was the one holding the dog hostage, which made him dangerous in a different way. Jack could feel his military training kicking into autopilot. His brain mapped out the distance between him and each man down to exact steps, the angles of their bodies, their potential reactions, their weaknesses, and then, the moment he had been waiting for appeared. The scarred man leaned closer to Elaine, his body language shifting from intimidation to something far more aggressive. Jack saw his arm move ever so slightly, the shift of weight, the tightening of muscles, the tiny adjustment of his feet. It was the kind of movement that revealed intention, the kind Jack had learned to spot long before most people even recognized danger. That slight change told him everything. The man was moments away from grabbing her or striking her. Elaine stepped back instinctively, but she had nowhere to go. Her back nearly brushed against Max, who was now snarling like he was ready to throw himself between them at any cost. Then the man with the knife tilted the blade in Max's direction. Jack's eyes sharpened with a controlled fury. He stepped out from behind the SUV and moved toward them with a pace that was calm but full of undeniable authority. He didn't shout or call attention to himself. He didn't sprint or make wild movements. He simply walked toward them like a man who already knew he could end the threat before any of them understood what hit them. His silence became his power. His confidence became the shadow falling over the danger. Elaine didn't notice him yet. She was too focused on the knife, too consumed by the fear of losing Max. Her lips parted in a silent prayer, her body shaking. Jack felt a surge of urgency. She was close to breaking, close to collapsing under fear. If she fainted or panicked, things could spiral fast. But he had been trained for far worse scenarios. He had rescued people under gunfire, shielded children during explosions, and carried injured teammates across desert sands. Compared to those moments, this situation was something he could handle with precision. Just as the man with the cap pulled Max's leash violently again, forcing the dog to whine from the rough grip, Jack reached a distance where he was ready to act. And in that instant, cold determination settled into his bones. He whispered under his breath, "Not on my watch." He was no longer a retired Navy SEAL. He was the protector stepping back into the role he was born for. And the thugs had no idea that their next moments were about to change everything. Jack Dalton moved closer with a steady calm that did not match the danger ahead of him. His steps were firm but silent, not rushed or frantic, not aggressive or loud. Instead, they carried the confidence of someone who had walked into far worse situations and survived them with absolute focus. The three men had no idea what was coming. They remained too absorbed in tormenting Elaine and bullying Max. They were laughing among themselves, savoring the fear they were creating, certain that no one was watching. The scarred man stood the closest to Elaine, his body towering over her as she trembled visibly. He kept one hand near his pocket as if ready to pull something out, while his voice dripped with the arrogant confidence of a man who believed he controlled the moment. Elaine's back was nearly pressed against Max, and she kept whispering to the dog in a quivering voice to stay calm, though every muscle in her body screamed that she was seconds away from a breakdown. Jack's mind scanned every angle in a split-second distance. Threats, weak points, possible reactions. He noted the way the knife holder tapped the blade against his thigh, a subtle sign of agitation and readiness, and the way the man gripping Max's leash kept jerking it, treating the dog's pain like some sort of game. Jack also noticed how Elaine's breathing grew faster and shallower, her chest rising quickly as panic took over. He could tell she was close to crying, maybe close to fainting. Her hands trembled so violently that Jack worried she would lose her grip on Max, making it easier for the man to drag the dog away. It was a scene he had witnessed countless times: innocent people cornered by men who fed off fear. That was the one thing Jack always hated the most. The sight of people suffering because someone stronger chose to hurt rather than help. Just as the cap-wearing man pulled the leash hard enough to make Max yelp in pain, Jack acted. He stepped forward into the open, no longer hiding behind cars or trees. His presence alone carried weight. He didn't raise his voice, didn't scream or shout to draw attention. Instead, he spoke with a calm authority that sliced through the tension like a blade. "Let go of the dog," he said. His tone was controlled, firm, and absolutely unmistakable, one that instantly disrupted the men's confidence. All three looked toward him at once, surprised by the deeply grounded voice that came from behind them. The scarred man narrowed his eyes, annoyed that someone had interrupted their fun. "Who the hell are you?" he snapped, but Jack didn't answer. He didn't owe them an explanation. He just repeated his command with even more steel in his voice. "Let go of the dog." The man with the cap scoffed and rolled his eyes. "Mind your business, old man," he sneered, still yanking on Max's leash. But for the first time, the leash slipped slightly from his grip because Max lunged with surprising force toward Jack. Sensing a protector, Jack took another step forward, his expression unreadable except for a faint tightening around his jaw. His eyes locked on the man with the knife, who had instinctively raised his weapon when he saw Jack approaching. "Back off," the man with the knife threatened, waving the blade as though he thought it would intimidate someone like Jack. But Jack recognized the insecurity in the gesture. It was too shaky, too showy, the move of someone who didn't truly know how to use a weapon. He didn't wait for the situation to get worse. In one fluid motion, Jack closed the distance between himself and the knife holder. The man reacted to slowly, swinging the blade outward in a clumsy arc that Jack easily dodged by shifting his upper body sideways. Jack caught the man's wrist, twisted it downward with controlled force, and applied pressure that sent a shock of pain through the man's arm. The switchblade clattered to the ground as the thug let out a sharp cry and fell to his knees, holding his wrist in agony. Elaine gasped, covering her mouth, while Max barked fiercely, as if cheering Jack on. The scarred man lunged at Jack, but Jack moved faster. He pivoted his body, used the man's momentum against him, and slammed him to the ground with a swift, trained movement. The impact sent the man's breath whooshing out, and he groaned while clutching his ribs. Jack didn't stop there. He pinned the man with his knee, ensuring he couldn't get back up. The third man, the one holding Max's leash, froze for a moment, stunned by how quickly the situation had changed. He looked from his injured friends to Jack, then back to the dog still snarling at him. Fear flickered across his face, but instead of backing off, the man did something stupid. He tried to grab Elaine. He lunged toward her with an outstretched arm. Perhaps thinking a hostage would stop Jack, Max reacted instantly. The dog launched forward with a powerful leap, tearing free from the man's weakened hold on the leash. Max clamped his jaws onto the man's forearm with fierce loyalty, forcing a scream out of him. Elaine stumbled backward, nearly falling, and clutched her chest in terror and shock. Jack moved toward them with lightning precision. He grabbed the man by the collar and slammed him against a tree with a controlled force that kept Max from getting hurt. The man's head hit the bark with a dull thud, and he dropped to the ground with Max still growling above him. Jack bent down, gently commanded, "Easy, boy," and Max immediately backed off, though his protective posture remained firm. Elaine stood frozen, tears brimming in her eyes. She couldn't speak. She couldn't even fully process what had happened. All she saw was a blur of movement, a man she had never met fighting off 3 threats with the kind of skill she had only seen in movies. Her heart beat wildly in her chest as she wiped a tear from her cheek and tried to steady herself. Jack approached her calmly, his voice softening. "Are you okay?" he asked, placing a protective but respectful distance between them. Elaine nodded shakily, unable to form a word. Max rushed to her side, nudging her hand as if assuring her that everything was okay now. Sirens echoed faintly from somewhere far off. Someone must have seen something and called for help. Or maybe Jack's intervention drew attention. Jack remained alert, ready in case any of the men tried to get up again. But they were all groaning on the ground, completely disarmed and overwhelmed. Elaine looked at Jack with disbelief and relief mixing in her eyes. You saved us," she whispered, her voice breaking. Jack gave a small nod, his expression gentle now. "You're safe," he said calmly, straightening his posture. "I promise." And in that moment, under the warm glow of daylight, something shifted. The nightmare was finally ending, and a hero none of them expected had stepped into their lives when they needed him most. The distant wail of sirens grew louder with every passing second, echoing through the morning air like a promise that help was finally on its way. Elaine stood still, clutching Max tightly, her body trembling from the overwhelming rush of fear and relief mixing together until she couldn't tell where one emotion ended and the other began. Her heart had not yet slowed. It still pounded heavily in her chest as if trying to catch up with everything that had just unfolded before her eyes. She kept looking at the 3 men lying on the ground moaning, defeated, shocked, still unable to believe that moments earlier they had held absolute power over her. Now they were powerless, rendered harmless by a single man who had appeared out of nowhere like a silent guardian. Jack Dalton remained standing close to her, not in an intrusive way, but in a manner that made her feel protected. His posture was calm yet alert, the stance of someone who was used to danger and had learned never to lower his guard until the threat was completely gone. His breathing was steady, his gaze sharp, and there was a quiet intensity in his presence, like a soldier whose mind never fully left the battlefield. Yet at the same time, there was warmth in the way he glanced at her and Max, checking them with subtle, worried eyes to ensure they were truly unharmed. Elaine noticed the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw tightened each time one of the thugs groaned or attempted to move. Even after overpowering them, he remained prepared to act again if necessary. That level of awareness, she realized, did not come from ordinary life. It came from training, discipline, and years of facing real danger. When the police cars finally pulled up, the flashing red and blue lights danced across the park like streaks of fire. Doors opened quickly, and officers emerged with urgency, their hands on their radios and holsters, ready for a serious situation. Several officers rushed forward, startled by the sight of 3 grown men sprawled on the ground, clutching their ribs and arms while groaning in pain. One of the officers, a tall man with a stern face and neatly trimmed beard, paused mid-step when he recognized Jack. A look of surprise flashed across his face before he raised his eyebrows and muttered, "Dalton, is that you?" Jack offered a slight nod, though his expression didn't change much. "Morning, Officer Reed," he said calmly, as if they were old neighbors meeting at a grocery store instead of at a crime scene. Reed shook his head with a half-smile of disbelief. "I should have known," he muttered. "Something happens on this side of town, and somehow you're right in the middle of it." Elaine stared at Jack in confusion. She had no idea the police knew him. Her voice came out soft and uncertain as she asked, "You know each other?" Officer Reed smiled gently at her, his tone shifting to something more respectful when he addressed her. "Ma'am, this man is Jack Dalton," Reed said. "Former Navy SEAL, one of the best this country has ever produced." Elaine's mouth parted slightly, her eyes widening as she looked at Jack with a new kind of awe. She had suspected he was skilled, maybe even trained in self-defense, but she never imagined he was a highly trained military operator. Jack gave a faint shrug, clearly uncomfortable with attention. He rarely enjoyed being praised or recognized for his past. He preferred quiet anonymity. He preferred peace. But today, peace had not been an option. The officers quickly moved to handcuff the 3 men, lifting them from the ground and securing their hands behind their backs. The thugs protested weakly, whining that they were attacked without reason, but each officer dismissed their claims. One of them pointed at the knife lying in the grass and muttered, "Yeah, sure, because innocent people always carry knives and corner widows in parks." The men fell silent, defeated and humiliated. Officer Reed turned back to Elaine and softened his tone. "Ma'am, are you hurt? Do you need medical help?" Elaine shook her head as tears filled her eyes again, though this time they weren't from fear, they were from the overwhelming relief of being safe. I'm okay," she whispered, wiping her cheeks with the back of her hand. Her voice trembled slightly. I can't believe this happened." Reed nodded sympathetically. "You were very lucky he was here," he said, nodding toward Jack. "These guys have been causing trouble all over town. But today, they chose the wrong person to mess with, and definitely the wrong person to mess with in front of him." Elaine turned to Jack again, seeing him differently now. He wasn't just a kind stranger. He wasn't just a brave man. He was someone who had spent his life protecting others. Someone who had walked through fire and chaos and still managed to stand strong. The weight of what he had done for her began to settle more deeply in her heart. She felt overwhelmed by gratitude, struggling to find the right words. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack offered her a small, warm smile, his first real smile since the incident began. "You don't need to thank me," he replied. "I wasn't going to stand by and let something happen to you." One of the officers asked Jack to explain exactly what he saw and how the fight happened. Jack spoke calmly, giving a factual, concise description without bragging or exaggerating. It was as if he was reading from a report, not recounting a moment in which he single-handedly rescued someone from danger. Elaine watched him closely, noticing how humble he was. He didn't boast. He didn't glorify the fight. His tone remained respectful, neutral, almost quiet. It made her admire him even more. Max stayed pressed against Elaine's legs, occasionally looking up at Jack with the same respect and trust Elaine felt. When Jack bent down slightly to give Max a gentle pat on the head, the dog licked his hand in gratitude. It was a simple gesture, but Elaine felt her throat tighten again. This man had saved her life and her dog's life, and he did it with a calm bravery that left her speechless. When the officers finally led the handcuffed men to the police cars, Elaine released a long breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The danger was gone. The threat had passed, but her hands still trembled, her knees still felt weak, and her emotions swirled in a way she couldn't control. Jack noticed this immediately and stepped closer, keeping his voice gentle and steady as he said, "I'll walk you home, if you'd like, just to make sure you get there safely." Elaine nodded, unable to hide the relief that washed over her at his offer. I'd really appreciate that," she whispered. Max barked softly as if agreeing. And so, with police lights fading behind them and the worst finally over, Elaine walked beside the man who had saved her, the man who had appeared at the perfect moment, the man whose presence felt like a shield she never knew she needed. As Elaine began walking home, with Jack and Max by her side, the atmosphere around her finally began to calm. The sirens had faded, the police cars disappeared down the road, and the distant chatter of morning life slowly returned, almost as if the world were trying to restore its normal rhythm. But inside her chest, her heart was still beating fast, struggling to steady itself after the rush of fear and adrenaline that had overwhelmed her. Every step she took felt shaky at first, like her body hadn't quite remembered how to feel safe again. Yet with each passing moment, as she felt Max nudging her leg for reassurance and Jack walking near enough to offer protection without crowding her, a gentle warmth began pushing aside the terror that had gripped her for so long. The sunlight filtering through the trees looked softer now, warmer, almost comforting. Elaine breathed deeply, letting the fresh air fill her lungs, trying to remind herself that she was alive, unhurt, and no longer trapped. She kept glancing at Jack out of the corner of her eye, studying the calm expression on his face. He walked with a natural steadiness, his pace neither rushed nor slow, but exactly the kind that made a person feel secure. He carried a sense of stillness within him, a quiet, reliable strength that was rare to encounter. Max walked close to his side too, occasionally brushing against Jack's leg as if reminding him he was part of their little group now. Elaine finally gathered enough courage to speak, her voice soft and unsure. I still can't believe what happened," she said, her words trembling slightly. Jack looked at her with gentle understanding. "It's normal to feel shaken," he replied softly. "What you went through was traumatic. Anyone would be scared." Elaine nodded slowly, grateful for his empathy. She looked down at Max, who kept glancing up at her with concern in his warm brown eyes. "I thought they were going to take him," she whispered, tears threatening to return. "I couldn't lose him too. He's all I have left of my husband." Her voice cracked at the last word, the memory of David hitting her with a sharp ache. Jack slowed his pace slightly, allowing her room to breathe. "I'm sorry about your husband," he said gently. "Losing someone you love, it changes everything." Elaine swallowed hard, wiping a tear that escaped down her cheek. "It does," she whispered. "Some days, I feel like I'm finally getting stronger, and then something happens and all the pain just..." She paused, searching for the right words. "It comes back like it never left." Jack nodded with quiet familiarity, his eyes darkening for a moment. "Loss never really leaves," he said. "You just learn to live around it. Some days it hurts less. Some days it hurts more." His tone held the weight of experience, as though he spoke from his own grief rather than anything he had read or heard. Elaine looked at him with curiosity and compassion mixing in her gaze. "You've lost people too, haven't you?" she asked softly. Jack hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah," he replied, his voice low. "Good people, brothers in uniform, and pieces of myself along the way." There was no dramatization in his voice, no attempt to evoke sympathy. He spoke simply, honestly, like a man who had made peace with the scars he carried but never forgot them. The quiet between them felt understanding rather than awkward. To people who had walked through different kinds of darkness were somehow finding comfort in sharing a small piece of their pain. As they continued walking, the neighborhood grew familiar again, with its well-kept lawns, flower boxes, and the faint sound of someone mowing their grass in the distance. Elaine could finally see her small but cozy house at the end of the street. The sight of it made her chest tighten with gratitude. She had feared she might never return home safely today. Max began wagging his tail, recognizing their street and sensing that the danger had passed. But even with her house in sight, Elaine felt a strange reluctance to let Jack go. His presence had become a silent anchor, and the thought of saying goodbye stirred a sudden heaviness inside her. When they reached her front porch, she paused and turned to face him fully. The warm sunlight illuminated his features, the calm eyes, the subtle lines etched by years of hardship, the quiet strength in his posture. She felt overwhelmed by everything he had done for her, everything he had risked without expecting anything in return. Her voice trembled as she said, "Jack, I don't know how to thank you for what you did today. You didn't even know me, and you saved my life." Jack gave a small, gentle smile. "You don't need to thank me," he replied. "Anyone should help if they see something wrong. I just happened to be there." Elaine shook her head slowly. "Most people wouldn't step in," she said softly. "Not like you did. You didn't just help. You protected me and Max with your whole heart." Jack lowered his gaze for a moment, as if humbled by her words. "It's what I was trained to do," he said quietly. "Protect the innocent. Step in when others need help. That doesn't leave you just because you retire." Elaine felt warmth blossom in her chest at his sincerity. Max barked softly, nudging Jack's hand with gentle affection. Jack chuckled and bent down to pet him, scratching behind Max's ears as the dog leaned happily into his touch. When Jack straightened again, Elaine hesitated before asking, "Would you maybe like to come inside for some tea or water, just to sit for a moment?" Jack looked at her with soft eyes, clearly touched by her offer, but also careful not to intrude. "I don't want to bother you," he said. She shook her head immediately. "You wouldn't be bothering me," she whispered. "After everything that happened, I don't want the day to end with fear." Jack held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded. "All right," he said softly. Just for a little while, inside the house, sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating framed photographs of Elaine and David smiling in parks, on hikes, and at holiday gatherings. Jack paused respectfully, recognizing the deep love preserved in each picture. Elaine noticed his quiet observation and felt a tender ache inside her chest. She poured him tea and sat with Max curled at her feet. They talked for a long time, not about danger or trauma, but about simple things. Their childhoods, their favorite places, the little joys that had once filled their lives. As they spoke, the fear that had gripped Elaine earlier slowly dissolved, replaced by something unexpected: comfort, connection, and the warm sense that life had given her a new chapter she never saw coming. Max rested his head on Jack's foot, accepting him in the way only dogs and children could truly understand. By the time Jack stood to leave, the sun had shifted into a gentle late afternoon glow. Elaine walked him to the door, feeling calmer than she had in years. "You gave me more than safety today," she whispered. "You gave me hope." Jack smiled softly, his eyes warm. "You're stronger than you think," he said, "and you're not alone, not anymore." As he walked down her porch steps, Max barked once, as if saying goodbye, but also as if promising that this wasn't the end. Elaine watched Jack leave with a heart fuller than it had been in years. What began as a day of fear had turned into the start of a bond built not just from danger, but from courage, gratitude, healing, and the unexpected arrival of a hero when she needed one most.